So let me tell you about the evening my husband's manager decided to measure my worth with a single glance. And how that glance slowly unraveled into a silence so heavy it changed the entire room. It started on a Thursday afternoon, when Daniel came home later than usual, loosening his tie with that careful, tired motion he always used when he didn't want to complain out loud. He set his laptop on the kitchen counter and said, almost casually, "There's a leadership dinner this weekend. My manager insisted spouses attend." I looked up from the sink and smiled, because I knew what that invitation meant in corporate language. It wasn't about dinner, it was about optics, hierarchy, impressions. Daniel had spent 4 years at that consulting firm, 4 years of long hours, quiet excellence, and credit that often seemed to travel upward instead of toward him. And the name I heard most often during those years was Marcus. Marcus said this. Marcus wants that. Marcus thinks the client prefers a different approach. I had never met Marcus, but I knew his presence lived in Daniel's stress lines and late-night revisions. Now, you should understand something about me before I continue. I don't look intimidating, I dress simply, speak softly, and I rarely feel the need to introduce myself with titles or accomplishments. I learned a long time ago that the people who actually understand value don't require a performance. So when Saturday arrived, I chose a tailored navy dress, low heels, and minimal jewelry. Nothing flashy, nothing designed to impress, just me. The restaurant was one of those upscale downtown places with dim lighting, glass walls, and waiters who moved like they were part of the decor. Conversations floated in polished tones, and laughter came in measured bursts, the kind that signals professional alliances more than genuine joy. Within minutes of arriving, Daniel was pulled into a cluster of colleagues discussing quarterly targets. I didn't mind standing slightly to the side. Observing rooms has always been a quiet habit of mine. You notice patterns when people think you're unimportant. You notice who listens, who performs, who evaluates. That was when Marcus walked in. Confident posture, controlled smile, expensive suit that was meant to communicate authority before he even spoke. He scanned the room quickly, greeting people with practiced warmth, until his eyes landed on me standing beside Daniel. There was a brief pause, the subtle kind people think no one notices. Then he approached. "Daniel," he said with a wide smile, shaking his hand firmly before turning to me. "And this must be your wife." His tone was pleasant, but his eyes moved over me in that familiar assessing way, as if placing me into a mental category. "I'm Marcus." I shook his hand and introduced myself simply. He tilted his head slightly. "So, what do you do?" It was a polite question on the surface, but beneath it was the invisible scale so common in professional circles. I answered calmly. "I work in strategic advisory." He nodded once. The kind of nod that signals polite acknowledgement without genuine interest. "Ah," he said, already turning his attention back to Daniel. "Well, Daniel has told me he gets great support at home." "That's important." Support. The word landed softly, but it carried an assumption heavy enough to fill the space between us. Dinner progressed with structured conversations about market trends, leadership frameworks, and performance metrics. Marcus dominated the table with confident storytelling, occasionally making light jokes about behind-the-scenes spouses who keep everything running. A few people laughed. Daniel smiled politely. I remained quiet, not out of discomfort, but out of patience. I have never believed in interrupting someone while they are revealing their assumptions. The moment that shifted everything came midway through the evening, when Marcus proposed a spontaneous exercise. "Let's do a quick case challenge," he announced, tapping his glass lightly. "Keeps the mind sharp." He divided the table into 2 groups, intentionally placing Daniel on Marcus's team and me with a few junior associates. Then, With a faint smirk that he likely believed was charming, he added, "Let's see how the support team handles strategic thinking tonight." There were a few soft chuckles, not cruel, not aggressive, just comfortably dismissive. Daniel glanced at me with concern, but I gave him a small, reassuring smile. The challenge involved analyzing a hypothetical acquisition scenario, identifying risk exposures, and proposing a restructuring strategy. The juniors looked nervous. One of them whispered, "Marcus designs these to be nearly impossible." I asked for the printed brief and read it slowly. It wasn't impossible. It was layered. And more importantly, it was familiar. Very familiar. As the discussion began, Marcus's group spoke loudly, confidently, throwing around buzzwords and surface-level strategies. Our table stayed quieter. I asked the juniors a few calm questions, guiding them to think about debt structure, cultural integration risks, and post-merger operational alignment. Gradually, their posture shifted, their ideas became sharper, more structured, more grounded. When it was time to present, Marcus's team delivered an energetic, polished response filled with jargon and aggressive growth assumptions. The room nodded appreciatively. Then, it was our turn. I spoke calmly, outlining a conservative restructuring model, identifying a hidden liability within the scenario's supply chain, and suggesting a phased acquisition timeline supported by data logic. As I spoke, the room grew quieter, not because I raised my voice, but because clarity has a way of demanding attention without theatrics. When I finished, one of the senior directors leaned forward and asked, "Where did you learn to evaluate integration risk that precisely?" I answered honestly, "I led a similar restructuring advisory process 3 years ago." Marcus's smile remained. But it changed shape. Less relaxed, more calculated. "Which firm?" he asked. I held his gaze steadily and replied, "The advisory division that reviewed your company's expansion proposal in 2021. There was a brief silence, the kind that stretches longer than anyone expects. Recognition flickered across his face. Subtle at first, then unmistakable. "You were part of that review board?" he asked quietly. "I chaired it," I said, still calm. A fork paused midair somewhere down the table. One of the directors looked at Marcus, then back at me, as if recalibrating an internal narrative. Marcus let out a short laugh, but it lacked the earlier confidence. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "that certainly explains the analysis." The juniors beside me looked at me with wide eyes, not impressed by status, but by the sudden shift in how the room perceived me. And that shift was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was quiet, deliberate, and undeniable. The conversation that followed became noticeably more balanced. Marcus asked more thoughtful questions. He listened more than he spoke. The jokes about support roles disappeared entirely. Later that evening, as the dinner concluded and people began to leave, Marcus approached me privately near the entrance. His tone was different now, measured, respectful. "I may have made an assumption earlier," he said. I smiled gently and replied, "Most people do. It's human." He nodded slowly, absorbing that without defensiveness. "Daniel is fortunate," he added. "Not just because of support, but because of perspective." I appreciated that he corrected himself without being prompted. That to me was more meaningful than any public apology. On the drive home, Daniel was unusually quiet until he finally said, "You never told them." I looked out at the city lights passing by and answered softly, "It was never necessary." He exhaled, a mixture of pride and relief in that single breath. "He looked at you like you were invisible at first," he admitted, "and then like you were the most important person in the room." I smiled slightly. "No," I said. He looked at me like someone he finally understood. Because the truth is, silence is not weakness. Underestimation is not loss. Sometimes, the most powerful shift in any room happens when someone realizes their assumptions were louder than the reality standing right in front of them. And that night, I didn't raise my voice, I didn't defend my credentials, and I didn't compete for recognition. I simply let the moment unfold, let the analysis speak, and let his smile slowly turn into silence. And in that silence, something more valuable than validation settled into place, quiet respect that did not need to be announced, only understood.